There was once a time when replayability was a metric by which a game's quality was measured. During the 90s, when games were shorter in duration and could often be completed within an afternoon, gaming magazines would frequently score replayability alongside broad, subjective categories such as graphics, sound, control, and fun factor. As time progressed, however, replayability kind of vanished as an important metric. Players were starting to demand longer games, while simultaneously the culture shifted to a one-and-done mentality. To me, however, that replayability metric is not only still relevant, but also a measure of a game's overall quality and design. A game that is enjoyable on a second, third, fifth, or even 10th time through is a game whose core mechanics are not just enjoyable, but are often deep enough to test and encourage a degree of mastery. As such, I played newly released Metroidvania Gestalt, Steam, and Cinder twice. 2 back-to-back playthroughs to test and see if the game was as good a second time as the first. If anything though, the game was more enjoyable that second time around, and it all comes down to that element of mastery. During my first playthrough of Gestalt, I was frequently scrambling to figure out the optimal or intended method to defeat each new enemy I encountered. Their attacks seemed to chain swiftly together, and my dodge ability required just a smidge too many milliseconds for recovery, or so I thought. However, with the right amount of experimentation, I started to pick out the proper timings and mechanics with which to eliminate my threats with ease. Part of this is recognizing some of the enemy types. Pure melee-focused opponents are often open to 2 or 3 swings before you need to roll through their next strike. With each new class of such an enemy, from the opening vaults to the criminal-infested sewers to the occupied sylvan forest, the timing windows become tighter and tighter. Unfortunately, because of how tight that window can be and the duration of dodge recovery, it's possible to have the pattern down but be milliseconds off in timing and get hit anyway. There are also shielded or heavily armored foes requiring the use of Tesla-charged bullets to stun, opening them up for punishment. This stun is part of the key design to Gestalt, particularly when it comes to boss fights. While your blade will reduce a foe's break gauge, the measure of which determines when they're stunned, the swiftest way to break an opponent is to use your Tesla bullets. The player starts with just 1 Tesla charge at the game's beginning, capable of unlocking up to 4 slots. 1 Tesla bullet means 1 Tesla charge, which can be recharged with standard melee attacks. While reducing the break gauge is useful but rarely mandatory against your average foe, it is a requirement against bosses. Well, unless you're some challenge run masochist. Bosses will take barely any damage unless you stun them, which provides a window to deliver some pain before they recover. After this damage phase, the break gauge will be impervious to stun efforts, the player needing to strike the boss enough times until the impervious shield shatters from the gauge and they can be stunned again. This creates a back and forth rhythm for each boss fight where the player must cautiously approach the foe, taking what swipes they can to recharge their Tesla bullets and access the break gauge, but also dodging and avoiding the boss's attacks. It's a dance of opportunistic defensive fighting, taking what shots in what windows are briefly available while focusing on evasion. There are downsides to this design decision, namely in that bosses fail to feel truly unique from one another. Sure, every boss has its own attack pattern separate from each other, but none of them change how the player approaches combat in any meaningful way, save perhaps a particular boss whose second phase is all break gauge and actively recharges the player's Tesla bullets. On the whole, however, I found the game's combat quite enjoyable throughout, and even more so after I'd begun to learn many of the tricks around seemingly difficult encounters. While I covered 2 common enemy types, melee and shielded opponents, there are a variety of others with unique attack patterns and are combined into challenging little arenas. This cloak and dagger woman, for example, used to be such a pain until I realized I could cut through her knives. I still wouldn't say I've mastered the combat, as there are several special abilities that I barely, if ever, activated, all of which use Tesla charges. These deal heavy damage, but their situational uses and the cost of a charge makes it difficult to experiment with them. Additionally, you don't really need to use or master them. On one hand, this makes the game accessible enough that you can beat it with only a basic understanding of mechanics despite only having a single set difficulty. On the other hand, by the end of my second playthrough, I was rarely in danger of running out of healing and taking barely any damage against bosses. Considering how much of the challenge can be brute force mitigated, it's a shame the developers, Metamorphosis Games, chose to implement only 1 difficulty level instead of offering a high difficulty mode. While combat and its mastery is a key component in Gestalt's appeal, the level and world design is equally important given its status as a Metroidvania. Unfortunately, the ability to backtrap and loop back around is greatly mitigated and even frustrating, as each sector is clearly designed in a standalone, forward-moving fashion. While you can thoroughly explore most of the world without relying on fast travel, many of the connections between each region are located in deep or inconvenient places. If you have to go from region A to region C, you will often have to cross through a healthy portion of region B to make the journey. This can make completionism troublesome, especially for the odd item and collectible intended to be picked up after you have no narrative need to return to that region. This is especially true of the different corgi dogs, many of which you'll need to retrieve after you've obtained an upgrade in a future section of the game. All the more, the reward for finding all of the corgis is an accessory that can trivialize the 3-boss rush at the game's conclusion. This means a game whose challenge can already be mitigated is made all the easier for what should be its most challenging confrontations. It should be noted that, while I found 100% of everything on my first playthrough, I intentionally avoided being a completionist on my second. Being thorough but performing no optional backtracking, I was still able to purchase all but one upgrade node on the skill tree as well as all of the crafted accessories. In fact, the game intentionally provides more upgrade points than necessary, so you don't need to 100% the game to complete the skill tree. This is good and bad, as it ensures that players that don't want to do much exploration won't have an overly difficult time compared to those who do. Collectibles should be valuable, and the player is always rewarded in equipment, ability points, money, or items, but a balance must be struck. Players who do not explore should not feel underpowered and therefore punished, but if you do explore, you don't want to make the game too easy. Backtracking and collectibles aside, each sector is a delightfully designed experience on its own, often having its own sort of gimmick to challenge one's progress through. Really, Gestalt is a linear game with optional backtracking, shining brightest as you're progressing forward and figuring out how to best the obstacles and platforming challenges. One of the early sectors is defined by the constant orbital bombardment tracking our protagonist, applying pressure to keep moving forward, to use against enemies, and to also utilize for busting open pathways onward. Another region is designed like a factory, filled with hazards and obstacles that must be navigated through. The penultimate region contains bouncy plants and high-powered turbines that lift and drift the player around the chamber. This is, perhaps, the factor that makes Gestalt just as replayable for the level design as it does the combat. Typically in a Metroidvania, the replayable mastery comes in efficiency, navigating through each area in as succinct and complete a manner as possible without wandering around aimlessly, and obtaining as many collectibles with as little backtracking as possible. With Gestalt, however, that emphasis is applied more to mastery over the platforming and obstacle traps, falling victim to them less, and expertly speeding through them more. That each sector has its own unique feature also means no singular mechanic will feel old or tired on a replay. So while there's a degree in mastering efficiency in item collection and backtracking, it's far more downplayed compared to the platforming challenges. The fast travel, however, has few points of access, sometimes placed inconveniently, and frustratingly, by time you finally unlock it, you haven't actually unlocked fast travel. They tell you that you have, but then they say you need to return to another point to actually activate fast travel. It's an odd decision. Judging purely by gameplay, Gestalt, Steam, and Cinder is certainly a game I'll be replaying whenever the mood strikes me. It joins Record of Lodoss War, Deedlit and Wonder Labyrinth, and Gal Guardian's Demon Purge as recently discovered Metroidvanias that just scratch the right itch, especially due to the shorter commitment time to complete a full playthrough. The game ranks well for me because it is so easily replayable. However, the story it's hard to really say, as the story isn't actually done. To say the game leaves room for a sequel is an understatement. This is part 1 of a multi-part story, a cliffhanger the likes that hasn't been seen since Halo 2. It's hard to comment on the quality of the setting, the characters, and the narrative because everything is a loose end. There are no characters with a clearly defined, complete arc. I wasn't originally sure why I was so wishy-washy on the writing at first, as it certainly felt better than I expect from most indies these days. Not everyone is quippy, you don't have awkward meme humor, the characters are all characters, their personalities differing from one another and having unique histories and attributes. This should be basic stuff, but even AAA games can't accomplish this much lately. I then wondered if it was a matter of presentation and being verbose. Any indie developer wanting to make a narrative-driven game really ought to play Iconoclasts, whose presentation of its story is absolutely top-notch. The animation, sure, but also in keeping the dialogue from being too wordy. No, the real problem I realize is that the vast majority of dialogue is exposition. This is a plot-driven story where the characters exist purely to slowly unravel a mystery, even though few questions are answered and far more are asked by time the credits roll. This is a shame because the characters feel like a waste as a result, and the mystery itself isn't even enough of a hook because I'm still not completely sure what this setting is. I have ideas and theories, but the primary focus of the narrative is the question of the nature of the Abyss. A question that never gets answered in Gestalt despite being the driving force of the entire game. No, that answer is saved for the sequel. Does this hinder Gestalt Steam and Cinder? Honestly, not really. A game like this, the primary reason to play it is the gameplay. The story enhances it, provides additional reason to play so that you might pick at and notice little details you missed previously, but it is not the driving force to play or replay this game. To that end, I highly recommend Gestalt Steam and Cinder. It was a nice palate cleanser after playing so much Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree especially, and is a quick enough experience you can easily squeeze a playthrough between major releases. It was an excellent indie effort, and the developers really do deserve to be rewarded. My only request to the developers would be to add a New Game Plus mode, perhaps one that keeps all upgrade nodes not linked to story progression unlocked, as well as accessories purchased and equipped, and a hard mode. These features would increase the game's replayability, I feel, though players can always perform their own no upgrade or no accessories challenge runs. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.